Hi everyone, happy Sunday. I'm Josh, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do my March wrap up. Before I get started, I want to point out that it is very early here when I'm recording, so I have some light coming into the window hitting me. Hopefully it's not too distracting from everything. But without further ado, let's get started. So this month I think I read 12 books. I want to say it was about 3,600 pages. I could be off about that, but it's about what I read. And that is definitely underachieving what I was hoping to read, but it's about the same as last month, February. But it's fine. As I said in my April TBR, I'm going to start planning smaller TBRs as long as my reading patterns seem to stay depreciated. More about that in a different video. We're here to talk about the books that I read this month. So, what did I read? I'm going to talk about these books from best to worst. Just keep in mind that that kind of list will shift with time. Even after I read a book, my feelings can change. So the best book I read this month, I've talked about so much. So I hope if you're at all familiar with my channel, you know what this book is. And that is going to be The Dysphoric Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred by Dr. Chanda Prescott Weinstein. And this is a book that is a lot of things. A nonfiction memoir at its core, but the topics that it's touching on, that it's discussing is as intersectional as the author herself. And this is a book about a black, agender, queer, Jewish scientist and physicist. And while the book starts out as a traditional science book talking about her science, and I think it's very interesting from that perspective, it very quickly evolves into a much broader conversation where it's talking about the intersectionality between race, gender, queerness, and race primarily. As well as just talking about gender and society as a whole. And I'm going to leave it at that. There's so much to talk about this book. I love it so much, but the reason I think it exceeds so well is because of the intersectionality of all the ideas that it explores, and it does so well. So highly recommend this book, as I've said multiple times on my channel at this point. Best book I read this month. Next was a reread that I got and read, which is Uncommon List of Ghosts by River Solomon. And I was rereading this for the slow read being done this last month, hosted by Broken Spine, Erica for the Broken Spine. And as you can see, I originally started reading this through a hybrid method where I was going to be highlighting everything, and I quickly realized I didn't have time for that. I added this book onto my TBR at the last second because of the slow read, and I knew I wanted to read it with them, but at the same time I had already removed some books from my TBR to make room for this, and I just didn't have the time to slow read this in a way that I was hoping to, just because I was splitting myself too thin. But this was a fantastic reread. I remember when I first read this, I really liked it at the time, but I was still worried that I had really high expectations for it. There was a lot of hype around it. And while I stand by it being justified, I was worried that maybe the hype may have clouded my judgment. And I don't think that's the case. Well, I don't think a lot of people give this a 5-star book. I think it definitely is top tier. And the point is that when I think about books that do what I love, this is one of them. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars, same as last time. So I still feel like it's amazing, if not perfect book, but I think it just does a really amazing job of setting up this really fascinating science fiction world with really provocative writing. I've heard River Solomon's writing being compared to Octavia Butler. I think it's actually kind of fair. I don't want to say detached is the right word, but it does feel almost as if we're just getting the world, and it's raw, it's emotional, and it's dark, but it feels so real and so captivating. But at the same time, it's exploring ideas around race, society, classism, as well as, of course, the ideas of gender. For more about this, I would advise you check out the live show that probably should have already happened by the time this goes up. I'll link to it below and probably in the cards, where we all talk about this on Erica's page, Broken Spine. It's a fantastic book if you haven't read it. Highly recommend. River Solomon is one of my new favorite authors, honestly. Which I guess is a good time to say that I had hoped to read River Solomon's newest book that's coming out next month in May, Sorrowland, but I still haven't gotten through it. And that's because it's not on audio, so it's harder for me to, be persistent with the book, but I'm still gonna keep trying to finish it this month, even though it wasn't on my TBR. Next was honestly a bit of a surprise at how highly I ended up rating it here. That's gonna be book 2 of the Inheritance trilogy, The Broken Kingdoms, and this is essentially N.K. Jemisin's mythology, fantastical, epic fantasy narrative. And what I really liked about this were a number of things. But first off, the writing was spectacular. The story was really good. I think I gave this 4 to 4.5 stars. I don't think I fixated on one particular one. It was like somewhere between there. And I love the mythology side. I love how it took some ideas that felt like they were inspired by like Greek mythology, but also from Christian mythology. And I love the mythos of the world that was built around the gods. And I love the new perspective we had. I was worried because I hate getting new characters in a series because I always means I had to learn new names. And I thought it was actually fairly easy. And I understood the characters well enough in the context of the story, and I really liked it. I will say that by the end, it does get sort of lackluster. In fact, the author, N.K. Jemisin, literally like breaks the fourth wall to say, look, I recognize that this story is getting kind of anticlimactic. And what it was, it felt like we had the main story end, and then there was a massive epilogue at the end. And the epilogue was itself very provocative. I still felt like it was an odd approach to the way the story was structured. That's the only reason why I'm hesitant to give it a full 4.5 stars. But still, a fantastic book. I'm really excited to continue the series, and I'm so glad I got to this because I was worried that I wouldn't get to it because I've been having N.K. Jemisin on my TBR for like the last couple months, and I keep not finding time for it. Partly just because I don't know, I was worried that I wouldn't like it as much. Maybe I would have forgotten the characters. I wouldn't remember the world, but which was honestly a problem. I couldn't remember exactly where we left off, so I had to do a little bit of research there. But it was a lot easier to get back into than I thought, and I'm very happy. Next was a book that I gave 4 stars, and I have some critiques to give to it. But honestly, I want to be clear. I really, really like this book, despite my inclination to critique it. And that's going to be Clay's Ark, book 3 in the Patternist series by Octavia E. Butler. And this is a book that I've been reading for this Octavia Butler Slow Read, hosted by Jerry from Onyx Pages. And what I liked about this book, in the context of the series, I think it was the best science fiction book in the series so far, in the sense that the world that was created here felt like it was the most provocative and creative. Don't get me wrong, I mean, there's so much that was being done in the previous books, but when it comes to science fiction, this felt more science fiction, less fantasy, I guess. And the fact that it wasn't just a really fascinating world that's been built to explore the societal themes that are going on in here, but it was the science fiction, or the science used to do that. It felt more intense in the science fiction side, in the sense that we have essentially an alien infection, and the way that infection takes place feels like it's mirroring so many different things, from a zombie apocalypse to Alien to The Thing. There's so many conversations in here about identity and self, and the world that's being built here. I thought it was so good. Like, don't get me wrong, there's always some really difficult concepts and themes that Octavia Butler explores in this series, or in her books in general, and there's some problematic ones that I explored here, but at the same time, I think it's like they're unavoidable. If we're given this world, this situation is probably going to happen, and it's very believable from that sense. So it's like you're given impossible situations, you have to pick on which one is the right decision, which honestly I think is the real world more than people want to believe. Like that's just reality. And for me, I think this book just shines so well because of the science fiction side, and in that sense, it's like almost one of my favorite books in the series, but also in the context of the series, I can't say it is the best in the series. It's like a favorite, but also not the best. And I can't disconnect its place in the series, which is why I'm giving it 4 stars. I'm giving other ones in the series a 4.5. Because in the context of the series, it feels like a sidestep, like we're getting a completely different set of characters to explore a different idea. And I believe that's because this book was written, like these books were all written out of order, non-chronologically. And the book that's coming next, when the next 2 books, have to do with the creatures in this, I think it somehow interacting with the main characters of the first 2 books. And it's that intersection, I think, that the author wanted to give some context to how we got there. But in doing so, when reading chronologically, it's what really takes us out of the story. And I can't help but wonder if it really fits into the narrative. Honestly, I feel like I would have loved to see 2 independent stories set in the same world, 2 different series rather, that then converge into one final series. So you have like 2 or 3 books that start maybe as a duology or a trilogy that explore these 2 independent stories that are building and then clash. That would have been like, imagine having that. Anyone who's read this book, imagine that was the case. We did that. It's kind of like in Anne Rice, how she takes the witches and the vampires and she turns them into one series, or something like that. Like, lets them clash. I think that would have been very provocative, and it would have just felt more natural getting the story in that manner, I think, than trying to fit it into this narrative where it doesn't quite fit as well. But still, I really, really liked it, particularly just the science side. It also reminded me of Annihilation, the movie and the book. I love things that explore astrobiology. I'm a big fan of astrobiology. But anyways, next is a 4-star, getting to 4 stars, like a solid 4 stars, which I guess that was 2, but it's going to be the first autobiography or memoir by Frederick Douglass. I do not know why it's so hard for me to check the storage on my phone before I start filming, but I'm here again, continuing where I was. Frederick Douglass's first memoir. I read his first autobiography and memoir, Narrative of a Life. When I originally conceived this idea of reading this book this month, that is adding it to my TBR, I was going to read at least the first 2, if not the whole thing, but I realized that I have too many books I want to read, and I decided to take it slower. And his first book was really short, so it was easy for me to get through. What I will say is I really liked it. It was a really fascinating look at the first part of his life. This was written, I think, when he was, 27, 28, so he was still really young, younger than me at this point. And he went through so much. And it essentially explores his time in dealing with slavery through the point that he has escaped and is just starting to be an abolitionist. And the narrative that he explores is similar to other ones that I've seen told, but they're all unique in their own way, and I found it very powerful. I don't have a good reason why I didn't give it a full 5 stars. It's just some books, it's just a matter of just how well it resonates. And while it was a very powerful narrative, and I highly recommend it, it just felt like 4 stars to me. And I feel kind of weird saying that about a memoir that is really such a powerful story. Maybe it was just because I know it's not his entire life, that there's more to it. It's hard for me to see that and think this is a complete narrative. It's clear there's more to come, and it affects my feelings towards the book, towards the memoir. But I definitely recommend it. I'm glad that I read it this month. It was my anti-racist book of the month. It's really good because we get a detailed look at his life, his memory of how his life played out up until he was freed, and he doesn't shy away from the really darker side. And what I really found was really powerful in this, one of the most powerful things, was how he learned to read. How it started with one slave owner who wanted to teach him, and then of course she caught flack for that, because obviously it's harder to suppress someone when they're educated, and that really sparked the beginning of his slow arising of information. And there is a clear line, I'm not sure if it was intentional here, but it's a clear line from him learning to read to his motivation to become free and to become an abolitionist. A story of education is always a very powerful one, personally, and that was one of the most moving parts of the book, was seeing that journey. It makes you wonder if he hadn't had that one slave owner who decided to do that, the direction he would have gone. Although, to be clear, I'm not saying that slave owner was the reason he learned to read. It seemed to be the initial spark that pushed him to break the norms, to try and find ways to do it. And it wasn't as if she taught him everything to read. She taught him the alphabet, I think, and from there he went above and beyond to try and find ways to learn how to read. So he was very much self-taught. Like I said, that was just one of the biggest parts of the narrative that really stuck out to me. I am hoping to finish the rest of this year. The other 2 are much longer, like 8 times longer. I think it's like 100 pages, the rest are 800 pages. But I'm really intrigued to see where we go. Is every memoir going to be like his entire life up to that point, or are we going to look like a situation with Maya Angelou, who tells stories in pieces? I know in the first one he doesn't go very deeply into how he escaped slavery, because he did not want slave owners to figure out how people escape. So I wonder if he's going to explore that in more detail in his later books, because I want to say that we get closer to, if not up to, abolition. Yes, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, the last book, is 1881, after the emancipation of slaves, and I think it was 1860 something. Great book, recommend. Okay, and next we have my only horror book of the month, I think. It was very important to me that I did, of the books that I managed to get to this month for my TBR, this was the one that I did get to, because it's horror and I'm not reading enough horror this year for some reason. But this is The Devil in the Silver, a novel by Victor Laval, and this was narrated by him, first off, let me say, top tier. I'm always nervous, or at least I used to be nervous about hearing authors narrate. Now I feel better about it. I still felt like this goes beyond just that. It also, he just does a really good job with the voices in here, and I was very convinced it was very, very high quality narration here. And I wish he would narrate the rest of his books. This book, I thought, for some reason, like some idiotic reason that because there's a monster here, oh, it must be a werewolf story. I need to stop inferring a narrative based off of tiny details on the cover. It's a real problem, a very big problem for me. And even then, it's like, look, there's horns. This is not a werewolf. This is some kind of monster. And to give you the short version here, this book is essentially like Bloom Flew of the Cuckoo's Nest meets Lovecraft, and this here is essentially a Lovecraftian monster. And what we have is one black man who, it follows his story as he gets locked up in an insane asylum because he got into a fight with cops. They arrested him, and they didn't want to work overtime, so instead they sent him to an insane asylum for like the weekend, so they had to process him. And because of the system that was in place, he ended up getting stuck in the system for much longer than that. There's a lot going on here from the supernatural, but I think there's more going on. Like, it's mostly a psychological look of this system and the problems with this system, with hints of Lovecraft in there. I personally would have loved more supernatural Lovecraft. It almost feels like more psychological, like Shirley Jackson or Paul Chamblee, like in The Cabinet of the World or A Head Full of Ghosts. We have these things that could very much be supernatural, but it's very unclear for at least most of the book whether or not it's supernatural or not. And while that's very provocative, I'm a big fan of overt, fantastical, supernatural. But this isn't quite that, and that's okay. It's still a solid book. Really, really great experience. It was a really fun read, and really a thought-provoking one as well. But also one of those like really infuriating and almost like claustrophobic books, like one of those books where you see this character in this impossible situation, and it's terrifying, not just because of the monster, but because of the world that he's in. It's so real. These are abuses that are going on now, that are allowed now, and it's hard not to get somewhat overwhelmed by that feeling. Next we have The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. What the fuck is wrong with me? And I read this while watching all 3 movies. It ended up taking up all of my month in the sense that I was slow reading it, like taking my time in between other books. My goal was to read this and Lord of the Rings. It did not happen. I'm still reading Lord of the Rings. It's because I kept having to stop to make time for those 3-hour movies. And what I will say is that I definitely enjoyed the movies more when I was reading this. But overall, a fun book, 4 stars. I don't have much to say here. I have a vlog that I'm hoping to post when I finish Lord of the Rings where I talk about this more. But I think we all know what The Hobbit is. The world of J.R.R. Tolkien is like a prequel to Lord of the Rings. I think that the best part of this experience was listening to Andy Serkis, who plays Gollum, narrate this. Obviously, the narration of Gollum in this book is top tier, as always. It's so much fun. But everything else, like his ability to do voices, is spectacular, and it's very immersive, and it's just very, very well done. And I wonder if it would have been as good if it wasn't for Andy Serkis. We're now getting on to still 4 stars. I think now that I might say 3.5 to 4 stars, like somewhere in that region. It's called In the Quick by Kate Hope something. It doesn't matter. This is a book, a science fiction book that I read in my reading vlog, so I'll refer you there for more thoughts. But generally, it's a science fiction book about a young girl who gets into a space program at a very young age, and then she helps to solve a conflict. The story itself, I really liked the writing, and I loved the intersection of the science fiction and the science. It felt very immersive, very realistic, but not overwhelming as far as the science goes. But the story, I felt like it wasn't very focused, and I had trouble understanding the point of the book. So 3.5 to 4 stars for this one. 3 stars would be Pride and Prejudice. I don't know which one I read. This is a collection of all these different books here, but I read Pride and Prejudice, and I liked it a lot. Obviously, 3.5 stars may sound bad, but I think it was a pretty good book. I had trouble with all the character names, naturally, but I definitely enjoyed it more than I did the first time I tried reading this. I was fresh out of high school. I tried listening to the audiobook, and I was like, fuck no, I cannot get into this at all. But this was very quickly oh, I'm enjoying this. This is much more amusing than I thought it would be, than I realized it was. I didn't realize this was a comedy novel. I know it's not quite comedy, but you know what I mean. If you read it before, it's a comedic or satirical take or analysis of this sort of world of this rich people basically trying to get married. And overall, I really liked it. Sure, it's classic, it's Victorian, so in that sense I struggled a bit. All the characters made it hard for me to follow entirely. But overall, a positive experience, if not an all-time favorite. I did like it. I'm very happy because I'm excited to continue. It means I don't hate the experience, which means I can continue the books even if they're not like the best thing ever. Okay, next is another 3.5 star. It's going to be Witch's Heart, or The Witch's Heart by Genevieve something. And this was a mythological retelling in the same vein as Circe, where it follows a witch in Norse mythology as she gets entangled with a Norse mythological god. But the problem is that the other gods do not like her, and they essentially want to use and abuse her, and it leads to some conflicts. Overall, I like this. Again, this is in my reading vlog. What I would say is that if you like mythological retellings, you'll probably like this. But personally, I found the pacing somewhat like all over the place. It's up and down, and the speed. But more than that, I felt like I just did not connect to the characters in a profound way. Like, while I liked the story and I liked the way it was written more or less, I just did not find myself caring, feel invested in the characters, what were happening to them. And by the end of it, there were some moments that clearly were meant to have an emotional impact. They just did not. And I blame the author for that. So 3.5 stars. Lastly is a book that I feel like we're giving it 3.5 stars, or it may have actually been 3 stars. It feels like I'm critiquing it more than I really am. Like, I did like this book, but I'm giving this 3 stars for a few reasons. First off, I'm trying to be more critical when it comes to what I'm rating books. This is The Sacrifice of Darkness, a short story adapted into a graphic novel by Roxane Gay, and it is set in this sort of weird, nonsensical science fiction world where this man struggling with depression essentially flies his plane into the sun because he's looking for some kind of warmth or connection, and in doing so he kills himself and destroys the sun, and it sends this world into darkness. Then his wife and his son end up getting ostracized by the society, and this young girl you see here befriends him because she feels bad for him, and it follows their friendship and their relationship as it evolves, all while mirroring back to the relationship between his father and his mother and how they came to meet. And it explores ideas that are essentially around, like, obviously this is a romance narrative, but there's also ideas when it comes to capitalism and the way workers are treated. My problem with this is that it felt fundamentally kind of simplistic in the sense that it's just a love story, and it gives us this weird world where the weirdness feels like it's more just a mechanism by which to tell this simple story. It's like, we need this narrative to be told in a certain way, so let's create a world that is very easily molded to fit the situations we need. It just felt like it underused the world that it built. If it wants to build a nonsensical world where the science doesn't really quite make sense, okay, I just feel like I want more from it. I don't want it just to be a plot device. Maybe that's me being overly critical. I just felt like it felt overly simplistic. So 3 stars. And lastly, I thought I'd give this 3.5 stars, and I'll probably give it 3. It's going to be The Conductors by, I think it's Nicole Glover. I really wanted to like this, but there were just too many things going against it for me. First off, it is at this core a mystery story about trying to hunt down a murderer, and when it feels like a detective story of types, it's hard for me to stay invested. Now, don't get me wrong, there were other parts of it that I felt like were very engrossing. The story focuses on this married couple, and they're the ones doing the detective narrative of trying to figure out what's going on here, who killed this person. While doing so, it also has flashbacks to how their relationship came to be, and it's that breaking away from the main narrative that I found most compelling. And also, there's just the general world building. We have this world, this fantastical historical world, where essentially there's a magic system, and the way it's used is split along racial lines. And I thought this was a fantastical use of magic and incorporating it into this world where you have such discrimination going on. Now, as I said in my vlog, I recommend you check out Chloe from Thistle and Verse review of this, because she enjoyed it a lot more, and she had a lot more positive things to say about it. But also, I think she had a more in-depth analysis of the world, which I think is worth at least hearing out before you decide to get rid of it. I think it's just, personally, it was a story that didn't mesh with me. It wasn't a bad narrative, which is why I gave it 3 stars. It's a story that did not work as well for what I'm looking for in a book. And those are all the books that I read. I should clarify, all the books that were in my reading vlog are books that were an arc that I needed to review, even a couple that I had owned. So those were NetGalley arcs that I needed to review. Just full transparency, I just forget to say that sometimes. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting. I feel like I talked a lot more than I intended to, but I guess there were a lot of thought-provoking books, even the ones that were not necessarily my favorites. Thanks so much for stopping by. I hope you have a great day, and as always, stay safe, everyone.